So I'm going to tell you a bit about my story as an introduction to what happened at Morecambe Bay. So in 2008, I lost my baby son Joshua as a consequence of failures at Morecambe Bay at Furness General Hospital. Now Joshua was born a perfect baby boy, but shortly after his birth, my wife collapsed from an infection and she was treated with antibiotics and fluids, and she soon made a full recovery. But over the next 24 hours, my wife and I raised many concerns about Joshua. He had a persistently low temperature and he was placed in and out of some form of heated cot on a number of occasions, and he was breathing quickly. And at one stage, my wife actually called the bell by a bed as Joshua was making grunting noises. But despite this, the midwives looking after Joshua reassured us that he was fine, and he was never referred to a doctor until he collapsed at 24 hours of age. And at first, we were told that he must have a heart defect, and he was transferred to Manchester St Mary's by ambulance, and my wife and I followed by car. At Manchester, we were told that in fact Joshua was suffering from overwhelming sepsis, and this was the same infection that my wife had been treated for. Joshua's condition got worse in Manchester, and he was transferred by helicopter to the Freeman Hospital in Newcastle, where really he received absolutely world-class care. He was put on a treatment called ECMO, which is a kind of heart and lung machine for babies, and we hoped that this treatment would allow his lungs to heal, and we were told his prognosis was good. But tragically, on the 5th of November, Joshua passed away. And this was when staff had tried to wean him from this heart and lung machine. His left lung began to bleed, and there was no choice but to turn the ECMO machine off. So after 8 days of battling for his life, we lost Joshua. It's hard to put into words the pain and grief that caused, but by far the hardest part of coming to terms with his loss was what happened next. So the coroner in Newcastle initially refused to open an inquest on the grounds that Joshua had died of natural causes, and we were advised to make a complaint to the trust in order to have our concerns addressed. So a few weeks after Joshua's death, the trust advised us that his critical medical records had gone missing, so his observation chart had gone. And the trust actually carried out an investigation, but they refused to share the statements that staff had made with us. And although they accepted they failed Joshua, we were left with many unanswered questions as to what happened and why. And around this time, I started to make contact with other families who had lost loved ones at FGH maternity unit, and I started to notice patterns in what happened. I then referred my concerns about Joshua's death to the Health Service Ombudsman. They took almost a year, and they eventually told me that they weren't going to investigate. They said an investigation would be unlikely to result in a worthwhile outcome. So we were pretty stuck at that point. I think the system had closed ranks, and we felt we were never going to get anywhere. But two things happened next that I think really changed the course of events. Firstly, Cumbria Police confirmed that they were opening a formal criminal investigation. And secondly, I went back to the coroner in Newcastle and eventually persuaded him to open an inquest. And that inquest was transferred to Barrow, and it took place in summer 2011. And the coroner was incredibly critical of Joshua's care. He listed 10 failures, including a lack of basic medical knowledge and that there was a dysfunctional relationship between midwives and medical staff. And he wrote what at the time was a Rule 48 letter because he was concerned that unless further changes happened, more lives could be lost. Now, this eventually triggered CQC and Monitor, the regulators, to take action. And in late 2012, early 2013, various inspection reports and diagnostic reviews were published, which really revealed the very serious risk to mothers and babies at Furness General Hospital. But they'd gone unaddressed for a significant period of time. And this was the time when myself and some other families started to campaign for an inquiry, so we set up a website and an online petition and became very active. And in mid-2013, the government agreed to set up what we now know as the Kirkup investigation, which published in March this year. That report confirmed that the same failures, certainly in terms of underlying behaviour and system issues that led to Joshua's death, were ongoing at FGH until at least 2013. That's 5 years after Joshua died. And Dr. Kirkup's report found a lethal mix of failures that between 2008 and 2013 contributed to 10 preventable deaths. contributed to 10 deaths, 6 of which the investigation confirmed were preventable. So that's a real tragedy for the families affected. And just tell you a little story that really brings this home, I hope. On the day of Joshua's funeral, I went to a local flower shop to buy some flowers for his grave, and the lady in the shop asked me, "Are they for somebody special?" And when I explained what the flowers were for, she burst into tears and she told me that she lost a baby in the same hospital in 2004. But in her case, she said, it was just one of those things. There's nothing different anybody could have done. But years later, in 2013 actually, that lady had a knock on her door from Cumbria Police, and she was informed that the death of her baby was in fact part of the criminal investigation. And whilst the trust had told her that there was nothing anybody could have done, in fact, internally, there were documents that showed they knew they'd failed that baby and that if it ever went to court, they would lose. But she was kept in the dark, and she, after the police made contact, eventually had an inquest in 2014. So that poor lady had to relive her loss all those years later. And very tragically, Dr. Kirkup's report refers to that very case in 2004 as being the first opportunity that the Trust had and missed to correct the course of events, to tip the dysfunction of that unit back into the right direction. So when Dr. Kirkup's report was published, he said this statement: "It's vital that lessons are learnt, not least by other trusts, which must not believe that it could not happen here." And the title of this session is "Could it happen today?" So I'd like to finish my talk with a few reflections. So when Joshua's death was first reported in the local paper in January 2010, this is the statement from the chief executive at the time. He said, "Around 1,200 babies are delivered safe and well at Furness General Hospital every year. And latest statistics show that Furness General and the Trust as a whole are amongst the safest places in England to have a baby." And actually he was partly right, because the statistical data that he was referring to didn't indicate that the unit was an outlier. But we know that the Trust was far from safe. This should serve as a caution regarding anyone relying on high-level data as an indicator for safety in maternity services. I think the full report contains an excellent explanation. I think it's a really, really good report, and I'm very grateful to Bill for doing it. Contains a really detailed explanation of what happened and why. One of my key reflections is simply that the voice of people using the service wasn't heard. And the families who suffered harm were treated as issues to be dealt with, not tragedies that must be learnt from. And central to this was the repeated failure to adequately investigate either individual serious incidents or the wider systemic issues until the full Morecambe Bay investigation took place, which was published this year. And I'm aware of recent incidents of avoidable harm in maternity services that simply weren't investigated properly. I think the phrase "it couldn't happen here" is one of the most dangerous there is. And I believe that the full implementation of the Kirkup Report's recommendations, especially those relating to scrutiny of perinatal deaths and investigations following incidents of harm, are vital if we are to avoid similar failures happening in the future. Thank you.